The airport was a hive of motion, suitcases rolling, announcements folding into one another, 100 small urgencies moving in every direction. She moved slower than most, folding her scarf against the draft and keeping a careful hand on the strap of her tote. 72 years had taught her how to carry sorrow without letting it show. Today she carried it like a small private flag. Her ticket was in her wallet, the number checked and rechecked. A first-class seat she'd paid for after months of careful saving. This trip was a promise she'd made to herself, a quiet pilgrimage to a grave that waited with a date circled in her mind. The line at security pushed and shifted. Voices blurred into one another, except for the low hum of the gate screens. She watched for her flight, then adjusted her coat and moved toward the jet bridge with the kind of measured steps people only notice when someone moves with purpose. Around her were the usual faces of travel, suitcases, coffee cups, tired eyes, but she kept to herself, practiced and steady, as if the world around her existed to be observed, not to be joined. At the gate, the attendant smiled and tapped the screen. "Seat 1A, she said, handing over the embossed boarding pass. The attendant's smile had the warmth of someone sharing good news. The boarding pass felt like a small victory folded into her hand. She had earned this seat, not taken it. For weeks she'd clipped coupons and skipped luxuries, deciding this ride would be a small ceremony to a life that had held both joy and a long stretch of grief. First class opened like a separate street inside the plane, quieter and smaller than the rest. She walked down the aisle and felt the odd lightness of belonging where she had every right to belong. For a moment, she let herself imagine leaning against the window and watching the world thin into the clouds. But the world has a way of interrupting private plans. He arrived with a stride that made his presence seem like an announcement. A man in his 40s, suit sharp, phone in hand, eyes that moved through the cabin as if cataloging what belonged where. He paused in the row and glanced at the empty window seat. Then he glanced at her. "That's my seat," he said. The words were flat, automatic, as if he used them often, an expression for correcting the way the world placed people. His tone carried an expectation rather than a question. He reached for the armrest as if a steward's confirmation would be the only thing required to make it true. She looked at the boarding pass, then at him. "Seat 1A, she said simply. There was no tremor in her voice, only the fact of it, stated without flourish. He smiled in a way that felt like dismissal. "You're in the wrong place, Grandma," he said, a comment thrown like a hand to push her aside. A few passengers shifted. The flight attendant hovered, glancing between paper and person, as if the rules themselves might be negotiated in a furtive hush. He laughed softly, and without waiting for intervention, turned and sat, slowly, deliberately, in the window seat. The leather folded beneath him as if it had always known him. Phones came up, heads turned, a child's finger pointed. The cabin's murmur tightened into something else, an intake, a held breath. She reached out as if to reclaim what the boarding pass promised, and the moment her fingers brushed the armrest, he leaned back and fixed her with a look that made the space between them feel smaller. She did not shout. She did not flare. She stood there, ticket in hand, and the quiet that followed felt like the hinge of the day. An ordinary scene, tilting toward something that would not untilt. Then, right after that sudden hold, a short request for you. Subscribe and drop the country you're watching from in the comments. She folded the ticket into her wallet. Phones lifted, the cabin held its breath. She extended her hand and the man moved to stay, boldly. If you were standing in Eleanor's place at that moment, what would you have done? Share your thoughts below, let us know your country, and subscribe for more true human stories. The narrow walkway of the first-class cabin felt different from the bustling gate she had just left. Here, the air was quieter, layered with the faint hum of the engine and the rustle of polished newspapers. Eleanor walked forward, boarding pass gripped between her fingers, eyes searching for 1A, the seat she had dreamed of for months. But the sight that greeted her tightened something deep inside her chest. He was already there. The same man who had brushed past her with a smirk at the gate now sat reclined, legs stretched, tapping his phone as if the seat had been assigned to him since birth. The window framed his silhouette, and the sight of him lounging there, her place, her purchase, her dignity, cut sharper than words. He tilted his head, noticing her pause, and a smile played at his lips. Not the kind that welcomed, but one that dismissed. Eleanor stopped at the row. The number on the headrest glowed faintly. She pressed her palm lightly against the back of the seat, grounding herself. Her boarding pass was right. Her presence was right. She was not confused. A flight attendant approached, young, polite, and anxious in her navy uniform. Her eyes darted between Eleanor and the man in the seat. Instead of asking him to present his ticket, she leaned toward Eleanor, voice low. "Ma'am, perhaps we can find you another seat. Maybe just in the back?" It was phrased like kindness, but it was not kindness. It was displacement wrapped in customer service. Eleanor raised her chin slightly. "This is my seat," she said. The attendant's lips pressed together. She looked at the man, who gave a small shrug as if to say, "You see? Even she doesn't belong here." He didn't offer his boarding pass, didn't shift an inch. He just kept scrolling, comfortable in the presumption that the rules bent around him. Whispers stirred across the rows. A woman in pearls glanced over, her brow furrowing. A young couple exchanged looks, uncertain but unwilling to speak. From the back of the cabin, someone murmured, "Why don't they just check the tickets?" Another voice muttered, "It's obvious what's going on." Yet, silence held most of the cabin hostage. Eleanor stood steady, her hands still on the seat back. She thought of her late husband, how he used to rest his hand on hers during long drives, reminding her without words to hold firm when life tested her. That same steadiness lived in her bones now. The man finally looked up, meeting her gaze. "Grandma?" he said lightly, voice carrying enough to be heard by those around. "You'll be more comfortable in coach. Let me handle this one." A low laugh came from somewhere behind him. The attendant shifted on her feet, torn between enforcing the manifest and avoiding conflict with a man who carried himself like someone accustomed to winning arguments before they began. Eleanor did not flinch. Her grip on the seat tightened, but her voice, when it came, was soft, steady, and firm. "This is my seat," she repeated, her eyes never leaving his. The murmurs grew louder, the tension weaving into the quiet of the cabin. Some passengers angled their phones discreetly, capturing the moment. A man across the aisle adjusted his tie uncomfortably, while another leaned forward, eager to watch but unwilling to intervene. The attendant tried again. "Ma'am, if you could just take..." Eleanor raised her hand slightly, silencing the suggestion without force, only presence. She did not argue, did not plead. She simply stood there. The weight of 7 decades of quiet battles settled in her spine. The businessman exhaled in mock exasperation, spreading his arms wider across the armrests as though to stake his claim further. He smirked again, certain she would eventually back down, certain the world would once more tilt in his favor, because it always had. But Eleanor did not move. She leaned forward just enough to close the space between them. Her words, calm and unshaken, sliced through the murmur of the cabin. "This is my seat. You will stand up." The cabin fell silent. Every eye turned toward her, waiting to see if dignity could hold against entitlement. The man leaned back in the seat as though it had been carved for him, eyes sweeping Eleanor up and down in a way that made the cabin feel smaller. His smirk deepened, carrying that casual cruelty that never needed to shout to wound. "Do you even belong in first class?" he asked, the words cutting through the quiet. It wasn't a question, it was a declaration wrapped in sarcasm. He wanted the cabin to hear it. Passengers shifted in their seats. A few heads dropped, pretending to focus on magazines, while others kept their phones angled, discreetly recording. The flight attendant at the end of the aisle stiffened, but did not step forward. Eleanor's boarding pass was still in her hand, creased from her grip, the seat number printed in bold. She held it up, her dignity intact. "This says I do," she replied, voice steady, measured, without a tremor. The man chuckled, loud enough for the cabin. "Fake. That's what it is. People like you pull stunts like this all the time, try to sneak into seats you didn't pay for. Why don't we check it again?" He raised his hand toward the attendant like he was ordering service at a restaurant. "Run that ticket. Prove it's not a scam." The attendant hesitated, torn between protocol and prejudice. She reached for the boarding pass reluctantly, as if Eleanor were a suspect instead of a customer. Around them, the silence wasn't neutral, it was complicity. Eleanor kept her hand on the seat back, shoulders square. The faces in the cabin blurred into one quiet audience of discomfort. Some wanted to look away, others leaned in with quiet fascination. But none spoke, not yet. The attendant scanned the ticket again, then glanced nervously at her device. "It's valid, seat 1A, she said softly. The words should have ended the dispute, but they didn't. The man laughed again, a dry, cutting sound. Machines make mistakes. Maybe she swapped tickets with someone else, or maybe she flashed it fast so no one noticed. He shifted in the seat, sinking deeper, as though every excuse made his presence more permanent. The flight attendant shuffled, clearing her throat. "Sir, he cut her off. "If you want me to move, you better prove beyond doubt. Until then, I'm staying right here." He glanced at Eleanor again, lips curling into a grin. "Go on, Grandma, sit in the back. Let the grown-ups handle this." That word, Grandma, wasn't affectionate. It was a blade meant to cut twice, for her age and for his assumption that she didn't matter. A few gasps fluttered through the cabin. A woman across the aisle whispered to her husband. A young man shook his head but kept quiet. Eleanor's hand trembled for a moment, but not with fear, with memory. She saw her husband again, tall in his Sunday suit, leaning over their kitchen table with that same steady gaze he always gave her before a challenge. "Never let anyone take your place in this world, Eleanor," he'd said more than once, whether she was facing a rude landlord or a condescending bank officer. "You belong where you've earned. Don't you forget it." The memory rose like armor around her. She inhaled, let the air steady her, then fixed her gaze back on the man. His arrogance was loud, but her silence was heavier. Passengers continued to record. The glow of phones reflected in the polished armrests, each clip capturing the sharp divide between entitlement and dignity. The attendants looked at one another, waiting for someone else to decide. The imbalance of power hung in the cabin, not just a seat, but a question of worth. Eleanor reached slowly into her handbag. The motion drew every eye. Even the man in the seat shifted, curiosity flickering across his smug expression. She didn't rush. She didn't explain. Her fingers brushed past a folded scarf, past her worn glasses case, until they closed around something solid. When she pulled her hand back out, the leather of the bag creaked softly in the silence. All around, passengers leaned forward, breaths caught in the pause. What she held in her hand was not yet visible, but the way she closed her fingers around it told everyone in that cabin that the moment was about to change. The cabin was quiet enough to catch the low hum of the engines outside, quiet enough that every shuffle of paper, every nervous cough carried through the air. Eleanor's hand emerged from her handbag, holding two things, her boarding pass and her ID. Both documents had been tucked carefully in a slim wallet, edges crisp, names bold and legible. She set them firmly on the attendant's tray, the simple weight of truth laid bare. Her name, her face, seat, no ambiguity. No mistake. The attendant scanned the boarding pass again, and the small screen green verified. She checked the ID. Spotless, expiration intact. Eleanor had prepared for this trip with care, knowing each document was in order. The attendant's throat bobbed as she swallowed. She looked back at Eleanor, then at the man sprawled in the seat. Instead of acting, she hesitated. The pause stretched like a shadow across the cabin. Her eyes lingered on the man, searching his face as if for permission, as if his glare outweighed the black and white certainty of the documents in her hand. He chuckled, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "So she's got paper. Big deal? You think she can even handle sitting here? What happens when the turbulence hits, huh? Will she cry for help? Spill her coffee? Block the aisle?" He tilted his head toward Eleanor. "This isn't a knitting circle. This is first class." A ripple moved through the passengers. A woman gasped softly. A man muttered, "Unbelievable." But no one stood up. No one demanded fairness. The silence felt heavy, a silence that had protected men like him more times than anyone cared to admit. Eleanor did not lower her gaze. She did not step aside. She let her documents rest there like a challenge. Her fingers stayed lightly pressed against the boarding pass, her wedding band catching the overhead light. The memory of her husband brushed her again, steadying her spine. "Stand firm, Eleanor. The world will always test your place. Don't give it away." The attendant shifted nervously. "Sir, the documents match. She is assigned to this seat." The man leaned forward, eyes narrowing, his smirk tightening into something meaner. "Machines make mistakes. People make mistakes. You're really gonna toss me out for this old woman? She won't last 2 hours in this cabin. Just put her in the back where she belongs. She'll be fine. Everyone will be fine." It wasn't just arrogance, it was dismissal, spoken with the ease of someone who had never once been told no. The words weren't about comfort, they were about control. Several passengers raised their phones higher now, angles sharpened, screens glowing like small spotlights. A recording from the back row captured his laughter. Another from the side aisle caught Eleanor's steady profile, calm and unmoved. These weren't just passengers anymore. They were witnesses, unwilling to interrupt but ready to document. The tension pressed harder against the air. Eleanor's hand lingered on her documents a final moment, then withdrew. She slid them back into her wallet, tucked the wallet into her bag, and pulled out something else, her phone. For the first time since she stepped into the cabin, her eyes broke from the man's face. She looked down at the black screen, tapped it awake, and began to scroll deliberately. Her thumb paused on a contact. The faint buzz of passengers' whispers quieted as heads leaned forward. Even the man shifted uneasily, though his smirk remained painted across his face. Her index finger pressed the call button. The ring sounded faintly in the quiet cabin, one tone, then another, the rhythm echoing louder than any argument. She lifted the phone to her ear, her posture straight, her eyes forward. The cabin had already turned into an audience. Now it was about to become a stage. The man chuckled again, trying to pierce the silence. "What, you calling your grandkids? Going to tell them you tried first class for a day?" His laugh was brittle, forced. A muscle twitched near his temple. But Eleanor didn't answer him. She kept the phone to her ear, calm, unshaken. The third ring buzzed and the passengers leaned in. The cabin, once indifferent, now watched like the opening act of something they couldn't yet name. And then, just before the line clicked open, Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest suggestion of resolve. She didn't need to raise her voice. The act of dialing was enough. The phone connected. The line clicked alive, and a calm, steady male voice came through, firm yet measured. "Mom, you boarding already?" Every passenger who'd been leaning in shifted slightly closer. They couldn't hear every word, but they knew this wasn't a casual family call. Eleanor's eyes stayed fixed ahead as she spoke into the receiver. "Yes, I'm here, but there's a problem." Her tone remained level, unhurried, though the tightness in the air was enough to bend steel. On the other end, silence stretched just long enough to gather weight. Then came the answer, clear and commanding. "Stay where you are, Mom. Do not move." The words rippled through the cabin like a dropped stone into still water. The flight attendant standing nearest froze, the boarding device still clutched in her hands. She glanced at her colleague, then at the man in the seat. The authority in that voice wasn't ordinary. It carried the certainty of someone who issued orders for a living and expected them to be followed. The businessman shifted, the smirk faltering for the first time. His eyes flickered from Eleanor's calm face to the phone at her ear. He leaned a little closer, as if proximity might give him control back. "Who are you calling?" he asked, voice edged with unease. Eleanor didn't answer him directly. Instead, she listened to her son, his voice steady and sure. "Tell me the airline and the flight number," he instructed. She read it out softly, the details crisp and exact. Around them, passengers whispered. A young woman at the back muttered, "She's not playing games." Another man shook his head, tapping his phone to capture more video. The attendants now stood frozen, exchanging uncertain looks. They weren't dealing with a routine customer complaint anymore. This was something else, something bigger. The nervousness showed in their shoulders, in the way their voices faltered when they tried to interject. "Ma'am, perhaps we can just," one began. Eleanor's son cut in, his voice amplified by the speaker. "No, my mother will not be moved. She is sitting in the seat she paid for. I want the crew to understand that." Passengers gasped softly. The businessman let out a shaky laugh, pretending not to be rattled. "Oh, come on, what is this? You think calling your kid is going to—" He stopped mid-sentence as Eleanor's son continued. "This is Robert Davis, Federal Transportation Regulation Office." His tone didn't rise, but its clarity sharpened the moment. "I will be filing an incident report on this flight if my mother is not respected immediately." The businessman's face drained of color. He knew that name, or at least the weight behind it. Government oversight was not a bluff. His hand twitched against the armrest, fingers tapping nervously as though searching for an escape. The whispers grew louder. "Did he just say regulator?" someone asked. "Federal?" murmured another. Phones tilted higher, capturing every detail. The sweat beating at the man's temple, the crew's frozen expressions, Eleanor's composure. The lead attendant swallowed hard and adjusted her scarf, her voice suddenly deferential. Ma'am, if you'll take your seat, we'll ensure everything is sorted. She stepped back quickly, making way for Eleanor, as if the documents she had ignored minutes ago had now doubled in weight. Eleanor moved not with haste, but with the steady grace of someone who had carried herself through storms far greater than this one. She eased into the seat, and set her bag carefully by her feet. The businessman sat rigid beside her, no longer reclined, no longer grinning. But still, he tried one last strike. So what, your son's some government pencil pusher? That doesn't mean anything here. The cabin seemed to lean in at once. Phones held steady. Breath caught. Everyone waited for the answer. Eleanor turned her head slowly, her voice calm. She didn't need to defend herself. The defense was already alive in the speaker of her phone. Her son's voice returned, colder now, unmistakably official. It means, sir, that every second of this incident is already being documented, and you should be very careful about what you say next. The businessman's jaw tightened. His smirk was gone, replaced with the pale mask of someone who had suddenly realized the ground beneath him was shifting. The cabin held its silence, not neutral this time, but complicit with Eleanor. The businessman's bravado was slipping. His shoulders hunched slightly, his eyes darted to the phones pointed in his direction. He cleared his throat and forced a chuckle that sounded thinner than before. All right, let's not make this bigger than it is, he muttered, glancing at the attendants. Just a misunderstanding, that's all. She probably read her ticket wrong at first. We're good. But the words rang hollow. He had been loud enough minutes ago when he called her ticket fake. When he called her grandma and told her to sit in the back. Now, with cameras watching, his tone had shifted to a plea for grace. Only grace wasn't his to ask for. Not anymore. In the third row, a young woman in a denim jacket held her phone high, her live stream already buzzing with comments. Thousands of viewers poured in as the story spread from one notification to another. By the time Eleanor adjusted her scarf and settled into her seat, the counter ticked into the hundreds of thousands. Screenshots and clips bled onto social media timelines, hashtags rising like sparks in dry air. Another passenger in the aisle discreetly filmed the man's face, zooming in on the sweat tracing down his temple, the forced smile that looked more like a wince. The image would soon circulate widely, the embodiment of arrogance folding in on itself. Eleanor lowered herself into the seat with measured calm. Her hands smoothed the edges of her skirt, her spine straightened against the leather, and her gaze fixed forward. She didn't need to pose. The cameras caught what they needed, a woman returning to what was rightfully hers, while the man beside her drowned in the silence of his own undoing. Maya's voice rose over the scene. The lie was unraveling faster than he could restitch it. Every excuse, every smirk, every word meant to diminish her was now preserved forever, not in his control but in the eyes of a world that had seen this story too many times. The businessman tried again, voice brittle. Look, people blow things out of proportion online. Let's just settle down, all right? He forced a laugh, turning toward Eleanor. You and I are fine, aren't we? Eleanor did not answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any denial. The attendants shuffled nervously in the aisle. One leaned in, whispering, Sir, perhaps you should. But she didn't finish. She knew cameras were rolling. Every gesture, every decision was already public record. The man's phone buzzed in his hand. He glanced down, eyes widening at the flood of messages. Colleagues, maybe even his employer, all watching in real time. His thumb hovered, but he couldn't stop what had already escaped him. The internet had no brakes. In the back of the cabin, a young man whispered, It's trending, already. His friend showed him the screen. Shaq's seat 1A glowing across feeds, joined by clips replaying the moment he called Eleanor a fraud. The cabin atmosphere shifted. What had begun as quiet hesitation now hardened into judgment. Passengers who had looked away before now let their stares linger on him, eyes sharp, disapproving. He shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar. Eleanor remained still, hands folded gently on her lap, her expression calm but resolute. She had no need to perform. Dignity didn't need performance, it needed presence. And she carried that presence like armor. The businessman leaned toward the attendant, whispering, Can't you get them to stop recording? This is harassment. But the attendant didn't move. She knew better. Trying to silence passengers now would only worsen what was already spiraling online. From the front of the cabin, the door to the cockpit clicked open. Shoes tapped against the floor with controlled authority. The pilot stepped into the aisle, tall, uniform sharp, eyes scanning the scene with irritation. His voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" he demanded, tone-clipped, professional, but edged with annoyance. Every phone turned toward him now. The live stream counters surged higher. Millions were already watching, and now the story had a new character. The businessman swallowed hard, his face paling as the pilot's gaze landed squarely on him. The stage had widened, and the stakes had just climbed. The pilot's shadow fell across the row, his polished shoes anchoring him in authority. His gaze swept over Eleanor, then landed on the man beside her, who sat stiff but still occupying what was not his. The murmurs died down. The only sounds were the hum of the engines and the faint rustle of phones still recording. "Ma'am," the pilot began, his voice firm but even, "please, let's avoid trouble. We need everyone seated so we can depart on time." It was a script, the kind spoken out of habit, delivered without seeing the whole picture. His tone suggested inconvenience, not injustice. His eyes lingered on Eleanor longer than on the man, as though she were the disruption. The businessman leaned back, seizing the chance. "Exactly, Captain," he said with forced confidence. "She's confused. Probably misread her ticket. I was just helping keep things orderly." He chuckled, trying to play the part of reason. "Let's just get this flight in the air." A few heads shook in disbelief. Whispers grew again. Phones tilted closer. They had heard every insult, every dismissal, every attempt to strip Eleanor of her dignity, and now they were watching to see if the system would do it too. Eleanor didn't argue. She didn't match the businessman's volume or the pilot's clipped authority. Instead, she picked up her phone from the armrest and pressed one button. The voice of her son filled the cabin through the speaker. "This is Robert Davis, Federal Transportation Regulation Office." The voice rang out, calm and clear. "My mother is seated in the seat assigned to her. Any further disrespect or attempt to remove her will be documented as obstruction of a federal passenger rights investigation." The silence that followed was electric. The businessman froze, his smirk vanishing like smoke in wind. The pilot's face stiffened, eyes narrowing. Talma, not with defiance, but with the sudden recognition that this was no longer routine. The attendants shifted uncomfortably, their nervous smiles gone. Every passenger heard it. Federal oversight, passenger rights investigation. The words hung heavy, undeniable, pressing against the quiet like a verdict. The businessman tugged at his collar, sweat beading at his temple. "Now wait a minute," he stammered, voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "This is all being blown out of proportion. I didn't mean..." But no one was listening to him anymore. The tide had shifted. In the third row, someone began to clap softly. It wasn't thunderous, not yet, but it was steady. Another passenger joined in, then another. The sound built into a ripple of quiet applause, not for spectacle, but for Eleanor's calm defiance. For her refusal to be erased. She didn't smile, she didn't nod, she simply let her son's voice echo through the cabin, proof that she was not alone, that the silence around her had finally cracked. The pilot cleared his throat, his authority slipping under the weight of scrutiny. "I'll need to contact operations," he said at last, stepping back toward the front of the cabin. His polished shoes no longer struck the floor with certainty. They sounded cautious, measured, aware that every step was being recorded. The businessman sat rigid, hands folded tightly in his lap now, eyes darting between the passengers still filming, and the woman beside him who had not raised her voice once. He muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." But no one rose to support him. The attendants avoided his gaze. Eleanor leaned back into her seat, adjusting her scarf once more, her face serene. She had said little. She had done nothing but stand on what was already hers. Yet the balance of the cabin had changed, as if the walls themselves understood who truly belonged. Outside, the engines hummed at idle. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, as the plane remained motionless at the gate. A voice crackled faintly from the cockpit into the crew's headsets, but no one moved to relay the message. Passengers leaned into one another, whispering, "Are we still leaving?" The lead attendant finally lifted the intercom, voice shaking slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been instructed to hold on the tarmac until further notice." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. They weren't moving. Not until this was resolved. The businessman's face drained of color, his jaw clenched. He realized then what everyone else already knew. This was no longer just about a seat. This was about accountability, and for the first time, he was on the wrong side of it. The minutes dragged, heavy with a silence that no one dared to break. Outside, the plane stayed still, engines humming idly as if even the machinery sensed something unresolved. The attendants moved in stiff, clipped motions, heads bent toward their earpieces. Their whispers were hushed, frantic, the kind of whispers that spread news no one wanted to deliver aloud. Then came the announcement, not to the passengers, but to the crew. A call patched through from the airline's operations hub, executives already aware of what was unfolding thousands of miles away. The incident had moved faster than their schedules. Phones in the cabin had carried it into the bloodstream of the internet, and the executives were scrambling to protect what was left of the company's image. The lead attendant approached, posture rigid, face pale beneath layers of composure. She leaned toward the businessman. "Sir," she said softly, "we've received orders. We'll need you to step off the aircraft." For a moment, he didn't move. His head snapped toward her in disbelief. "Excuse me? You can't be serious. I'm not going anywhere. She's the problem, not me." He jabbed a finger toward Eleanor, the edge of panic showing through his words. The attendant repeated herself, firmer now. "Sir, security is on its way. Please gather your belongings." His jaw tightened. A low growl of frustration rumbled in his throat. "This is ridiculous. I know people in this industry. Do you have any idea who I am?" But the weight of his name meant little now. The cameras still pointed his way, and the eyes of passengers bore into him with no sympathy. His arrogance, once his shield, had turned into his cage. The shuffle of heavy boots echoed from the jet bridge. 2 airport security officers boarded, their presence quiet but commanding. The businessman tried again, this time softer, leaning toward them. "Gentlemen, surely you see what's happening here. This is being blown out of proportion. I was just making sure the flight ran smoothly." One officer's expression didn't flicker. "Sir, please stand. We'll escort you off." The businessman sputtered, muttering curses under his breath as he yanked his briefcase from under the seat. His movements were jerky, his face red with rage and humiliation. "This isn't over," he hissed, voice low but caught on the microphones of nearby phones. "You'll regret this." No one answered him, no one rushed to his defense. The same passengers who had once looked away now stared openly, some with quiet satisfaction, others with relief. His threats dissolved into the air, powerless. Eleanor remained seated, hands folded in her lap, eyes steady on the aisle. She didn't gloat. She didn't even watch him leave. She simply held her ground. The seat finally hers again, not because she demanded it louder, but because she never let go of what was already rightfully hers. As security guided the businessman down the aisle, the hush of the cabin was broken by a soft line of applause. It began in the back, then spread row by row until the sound filled the space. Not raucous, not mocking, simply a recognition of dignity defended. Eleanor's eyes stayed forward, calm as stone, though a faint glimmer of resolve shimmered in her gaze. Maya's voice rose, weaving through the moment. It wasn't just about a seat. It was about respect, about a lifetime of being told where you don't belong, and finally, in one quiet act of defiance, showing the world exactly where you do. The businessman's figure disappeared down the jet bridge. The officers followed, leaving behind only the echo of his threats and the memory of his arrogance crumbling. The attendants exhaled collectively, their relief visible in the slump of their shoulders. The lead attendant approached Eleanor once more, voice soft now. "Ma'am, please make yourself comfortable. The seat is yours." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her presence in that seat was answer enough. A vibration rippled through the cabin as phones buzzed all at once. Notifications pinged, lighting up screens in passengers' hands. Some gasped, others whispered in disbelief. The story had leapt from cabin drama to national headline in minutes. On one screen, a trending hashtag scrolled rapidly. On another, a news alert blared. Elderly black woman defends first-class seat against aggressive passenger, airline under fire. Passengers exchanged looks, their eyes wide. The moment was no longer contained within the aluminum walls of the aircraft. It was spilling outward, unstoppable, and the world was watching. By the time the plane finally lifted from the runway, Eleanor's quiet defiance had already left the cabin. It had taken flight in another way, through live streams, tweets, clips shared from seat to seat, until the whole world seemed to be looking in. The first headline hit within an hour. Elderly black woman denied seat she paid for. The headline spread like fire, mirrored across local outlets, then picked up by national networks. Commentators didn't need to frame it, the footage spoke plainly. A woman, 72 years old, standing with quiet dignity while a man sneered, mocked, and refused to move. The attendant's hesitation. The pilot's bias, the eventual intervention. The cameras had captured everything. Debates ignited almost instantly. Hashtags collided in trending lists. She belongs, Seat 1A, respect our elders. Millions of comments poured in. This is what Black women face every single day, questioned even when they have proof in hand. She showed more grace than anyone deserved. The restraint is remarkable. That airline better fix this fast, or they'll be done. What had begun as a confrontation over one seat became a mirror reflecting something bigger. Racism, sexism, ageism, the dismissal of someone who had followed every rule but still wasn't seen as enough, and the public wasn't letting it pass quietly. By midnight, financial news tickers carried the fallout. The airline's stock price dipped sharply. Analysts pointed to the online outrage, the viral clips, the headlines mounting in every corner of the internet. Investors called for damage control. The company's PR division scrambled, releasing a generic statement about investigating passenger concerns. But the statement did little to stem the anger. The businessman's identity didn't stay hidden for long. Online sleuths dug through details, matching his face to corporate headshots, LinkedIn profiles, and conference appearances. By morning, his name was everywhere. He wasn't just a man in a suit. He was a regional executive at a large logistics firm with government contracts. His smiling portrait, once used for press releases, was now plastered across social feeds with captions like, "This is the man who mocked Eleanor Davis." The backlash was immediate. His company received floods of calls, emails, and demands for accountability. By the end of the day, he had been placed on indefinite leave. Within 24 hours, his resignation letter circulated, stripped of its dignity. His career, built on entitlement and connections, collapsed faster than the seat he once thought belonged to him. Meanwhile, Eleanor's name was spoken with reverence. News anchors praised her composure. Civil rights groups highlighted her as an example of resilience in the face of systemic disrespect. Social media filled with posts honoring her. Portraits of elderly women in church hats, mothers holding tickets with captions like, "For Eleanor." But Eleanor herself stayed silent. She didn't post, didn't grant interviews. She simply continued her journey, her scarf wrapped tightly around her shoulders, carrying the quiet knowledge that she had not just defended a seat, but had forced the world to reckon with what that seat represented. Maya's voice threaded through the scene. Her silence spoke louder than any press release. She didn't need to remind the world of her worth. The world had reminded itself, and in that reminder lay the collapse of a man's career and the exposure of an industry's quiet prejudices. On the second morning, as she prepared to leave her hotel, Eleanor's phone rang. The number flashed on the screen. Airline headquarters. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the green button. Passengers across the country were still refreshing their feeds, waiting to see what would come next. Executives were in boardrooms, scrambling to salvage reputation. The man who once mocked her was watching his life unravel piece by piece. And Eleanor, calm, steady, dignified, stood with her phone vibrating in her hand. She pressed accept. The voice on the other end of the line was rehearsed, smoothed by years of corporate training. Yet beneath the calm cadence, Eleanor could hear the urgency, the scramble of executives who knew their company was bleeding in public view. "Mrs. Davis," the representative began, "on behalf of our airline, we extend our deepest apologies for what happened aboard your flight. This was unacceptable, and we want to make it right." They spoke of accountability, of internal reviews, of disciplinary measures. Then came the offer, a lifetime of free first-class upgrades, a gold-plated apology dressed as generosity. It was the kind of offer meant to silence anger, to exchange dignity for perks. Eleanor listened, her eyes steady, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of her scarf. When the voice finally paused, she answered softly but firmly, "No, thank you." There was confusion on the other end. "Ma'am, we want to." "I didn't fight for a seat to collect gifts," she said. "I fought because no one should ever be told they don't belong after paying their way. If you want to make this right, don't give me upgrades. Change your policies. Train your people. Make sure the next woman doesn't need a phone call to her son for you to see her humanity." The silence that followed was longer than any corporate script could cover. For the first time, the representative had no quick reply. Eleanor ended the call, slipped her phone back into her bag, and stood by the window, watching planes rise and vanish into the sky. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't shouted or cursed. She had simply insisted on being seen, and in doing so, she had forced an industry to see itself. Maya's voice returned, carrying the weight of reflection. Eleanor didn't just keep her seat. She gave a seat to everyone told they don't belong. To the elderly dismissed as fragile. To women dismissed as weak. To every black passenger asked to prove twice over what others are granted without question. Her victory wasn't just personal, it was collective. Across the country, conversations shifted. Airlines rushed to update diversity training modules. Advocacy groups demanded stronger protections for passengers. Universities discussed Eleanor's stance in ethics classes. And in church basements and family kitchens, people told her story as proof that dignity, quiet, unshaken dignity, could undo arrogance louder than any insult. The man who mocked her faded into obscurity, his name remembered not for power, but for collapse. Eleanor, however, became more than a headline. She became a reminder that justice often arrives not with thunder, but with steady resolve. Maya closed with words etched like a final chord. In just 3 minutes, her dignity ended a man's arrogance and changed an industry's silence. 3 minutes that proved resistance doesn't always roar. It sometimes sits calmly in the seat it earned and refuses to move. And then the invitation extended outward, past the story, into the listening hearts of viewers. What would you have done if you were Eleanor? Drop your thoughts in the comments, share your country flag, and don't forget to subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, because stories like this remind us, dignity is priceless. The story closed, but its echo lingered. A reminder carried not just in Eleanor's name, but in every quiet act of defiance that refuses to surrender dignity for convenience.